The second great fauna that we have seen arise in the geological record as a result of evolutionary biology experiments through time is called the Paleozoic fauna. The Paleozoic fauna replaced and came on board after the Cambrian fauna. It started really doing fairly well in the Ordovician, and there was overlap between the end of the Cambrian fauna and then the beginning of the Paleozoic fauna. And the reason for that overlap is some of the organisms are very similar. They're in the same group of seafloor organisms that were invertebrates, the corals and the bivalves and the trilobites. All these organisms were coexisting at the same time, but then the Cambrian fauna, we saw a replacement of some of these with other related organisms. So the Paleozoic fauna rose in the Ordovician and then really zenith and did extremely well through the run of the Devonian, the Mississippian, and the Pennsylvanian time periods going into the Permian. And they continued doing well until a natural disaster took place at the end of the Permian. A major meteor hit the planet, caused about 85% of everything living in both the oceans and on land to go extinct. And that 85% drop then in the diversity of life on the planet is shown in the fossil record. And again, remember kind of the invisible guiding hand behind the structure of how we understand geological time to have been parsed out through the millennia is the idea that a lot of geological time in the Phanerozoic is based on the radiation and then extinction of fossils. So the Paleozoic fauna is the second of the great faunas, and we're going to see that there were organisms that were familiar to us and organisms that were not. One of the advents of the Paleozoic fauna is the idea that plants actually began to take hold and radiate and evolve on the land surface. So we had some plants in the oceans, algae and other forms of plants, but then especially in the Ordovician, we see the first example of plants leaving the seawater environment and going into the terrestrial land environment. So we got a small foothold in the Ordovician, and some of these early plants, they were very simple in their structure. They had a very rudimentary root system, and the root system actually gave them stability and the ability to pump water and move water and actually hold water, because moving from the ocean into the land means that you're able to store water and carry it with you so you don't dehydrate. Another thing that happens is that you're able to solve the riddle of how to reproduce without water. When you're in water, reproduction has lower hurdles of difficulty than if you live in the land environment. There's multiple things, the ability to gain food and other types of nutrient sources. But the invasion of the land happened with the plants that marked the beginning of the Paleozoic fauna. Now, some of these early plants, they looked a lot like ferns, or they looked almost like small types of tropical trees that we can think of. They had various shapes, but they were very bushy and fern-like. And they started to colonize this land environment. Now, in terms of the geological response to this colonization, we saw that river systems, before we had plants, rivers could just flow and meander and cut through landscapes unconstrained. It was just based on how much water there was and then the ability to cut and to mold the landscape. As soon as plants came on board, we saw fundamentally that the ability of river systems to erode is constrained by plants. We see all the time in the modern day environment plants living along the edge of river systems and on levees. And those plant root systems, bind the soil, and they actually attenuate and control and determine some of the erosion that goes on. So the whole dynamic of eroding a natural landscape was altered by the invasion of the land plants. Now, another thing that is accompanied in the Paleozoic with the advent of the land plants is that provides a major source of food. So we see that a gigantic food source became available. And of course, the way nature responds, the way evolutionary biology responds to a new food source is new things evolve to eat that food source. So the land plants provided food, and then we had another major explosion then in the organisms that could live on land as well as in the sea. So everything changed. Now, at that same time period then, as we were having the evolution of the fish in the seawater, then we started having fish that developed capabilities to come on land. And we'll be seeing this evolution from fish then eventually into amphibians, the ones that can live both in and out of the water, then eventually into the reptiles. And we'll see how the great radiation of the three groupings of reptiles, one of which we've evolved from, all came about because of the proliferation of the food source in these land-based environments. Now, one of the things that we need to remember is globally, every place has fossils. Every country on the planet has got fossils. And every country on the planet has got a template or a basic suite of basic rock types that everyone runs around on and ignores on a daily basis. But something that's really important to recognize in the course of evolutionary biology is that these great discoveries have happened all over the planet. And when these discoveries take place, it's very common for people to name the fossils after the geographic locations in which the fossils were found. And we'll see this occurring over and over again through time. Well, in this Paleozoic fauna, as we had this whole succession of fish into amphibians, into reptiles, and then the land plants blossom, we also had the emergence of the insects. And some of the insects that we know of, the dragonflies and the butterflies, flies themselves, all kinds of organisms that are very, very diverse, all did very well in that Paleozoic fauna. And again, it's all related directly to the relationship of the insects to the diversification of the different types of plants. And one of the most striking fossil assemblages we have on planet Earth for this time period actually takes place here in the state of Illinois. And we have a very unique kind of fossil that we find, and indeed it's the state fossil. Every country, every state, every place, depending on what fossils are abundant there, they name one of those fossils a state or a country fossil. The state of Illinois, the fossil here is called a Tully monster. And a Tully monster, it looks something like a segmented worm that had some jaws on the end with a mouth. And it's very bizarre looking because it had a very small mouth and jaw system, and then it had a very long neck, and it kind of inflated out to be a segmented worm-like central body that had a bit of a flipper on the end. So the Tully monster is a weirdo, but it's extremely common in the state of Illinois. And the reason it's common is that during the Paleozoic, one of the time periods of that is called the Pennsylvanian. When you're in Europe and other places, the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian are combined into a time period they call the Carboniferous. And the Carboniferous is the great age of the coals. And so the Carboniferous in Europe was split into two divisions. The earlier one's called Mississippian, and the later one is called the Pennsylvanian here in the United States. And so this great time period of the age of coals, the coals were formed from having incredibly well-developed forests that grew out into marshy areas. And it was also a time period of having the oceans be relatively high because we had little to no ice on the planet. So all the ice that's normally bound up into the oceans released back into the water, and sea level becomes very high. So all the conditions were right to have a lot of organic matter deposited quickly along the margins of the oceans, and especially in deltaic systems and marsh systems that were right on the borderline between this the coastal regions of the world. So these very thick coal deposits were very important at the time period. And in coal swamps, you have a suite of environmental constraints that are just right to preserve very fragile organisms if they die and fall into the water. And these waters are very low in oxygen. And because they're low in oxygen, then they have a unique suite of microbes that live in the waters. And then you have the ability to have very high rates of sedimentation, very quick burial of something that dies and falls into the water. So the coal swamps are a great place to make fossils. The Tully monster is an example of that. The Tully monsters lived in these coal swamps, and when they died and their bodies hit the bottom of the swamp, before they could be eaten by something else, it wasn't uncommon for them to be buried very quickly. And they were buried in environments where the oxygen levels were very low, and it allowed to have this very unique, beautiful, perfect preservation of the organism. Now, another reason that it gets preserved is in these swampy, muddy environments, as the organism dies, its tissue breaks down and releases different chemicals. And some of these are organic acids, and some of them, there's just a whole suite of different chemicals that come out. And those chemicals radiate away from the body concentrically. So they start at the body that's decaying and then moves out. And so we see these chemical reactions that go from where the actual organism has died and is in the sediments and moves out away, and those chemical reactions actually make the sediments transition chemically into becoming a solid rock. And so the solid rocks that we have that preserve these, we call them concretions. They look like small eggs, but they're kind of flattened. And so these flattened egg-like structures are very common in coal swamp areas around the world, and again, especially here in the state of Illinois. If you take those concretions and you put them outside in the wintertime and then put them outside in the summertime, let them heat up to high temperatures naturally in the summer, freeze down to cold temperatures in the winter, they'll actually naturally crack open. And they'll crack open along the flat part of the flattened egg, and it pops into two pieces, and you open it up, and inside is a beautifully preserved organism. One of them is the Tully monster. But other things, everything that lived in the coal swamps were also preserved in this fashion. So the concretions have given us a fantastic fossil record of butterflies, where individual patterns and beautiful shapes of the scales on the leaves, they're all perfectly preserved down to a single cell level. We have plant material that looks like it was growing yesterday, perfectly preserved in this. And another great example is the Tully monster. So the Paleozoic was diversification at a level that the planet hadn't seen before. It involved not only the invertebrates, but then the simultaneous evolution of the vertebrates. And it included great success in marine environments, but then full-on invasion of the terrestrial land environments. And those are the characteristics of the Paleozoic fauna.